Welcome back to the Rise with Anita Podcast, or welcome if you're new here. If you're new here, this is a space where ambition meets embodiment, where soul meets strategy, and where we don't just talk about transformation, we learn how to actually live it in real time. So today's episode really feels special. And it's not just because it's the 100th episode, but it's because I'm finally stopping long enough to really appreciate what 100 episodes of this podcast really means, especially when I think about what it has required me to become. You see, it's easy to celebrate a number, a milestone, and I am so proud that we've made it to 100 episodes. Because when I look at it, it's hundreds of hours of conversations. Guess I once admired saying yes to just taking a chance and having a conversation. Solo episodes where behind the scenes, some days I was excited and inspired. Others I was actually struggling behind the scenes, dealing with a very challenging time of my life. There were moments that resonated, moments where I realized I spoke a little too quickly. I learned how to listen better on this show. There were conversations that stretched me in my capacity, and it was me trying to keep up. But today isn't really just about one number, though I am incredibly, incredibly proud to have hit 100 episodes because it just shows what a dedication I've had to this. But really more so, I want to talk to you guys today about the woman I had to be behind that number, because I want to take a moment to just honor that version of myself. But before we begin, you know that I like to arrive together. So if you're able to do so, and you are actually not driving, please gently place your feet on the ground. Relax your shoulder and any tension you might have in your jaw. And we're going to take a slow inhale through the nose together. We're going to hold and gently exhale. Again, we're going to do another deep inhale through the nose for 4. We're going to hold for 4 and release through the mouth for 6. And as you're finishing your breath, I want you to sit with this question in the back of your mind. Who have I became because I kept showing up for myself? I don't want this to be about your accomplishments or what you've produced. Those are incredible. But really, I want you to look at the identity. Who have I become? And with that, let's begin. You see, when I first made this decision to start the podcast, I really didn't know clearly what I was creating. You see, I knew I had a voice that I wanted to start to share. I knew that I wanted to connect with people and hear their stories and hear their life lessons. I knew I wanted women to feel like they had a place to go that felt safe, that they could feel some sort of support. And I knew I believed that healing belongs in the everyday life, not just inside of retreats or therapy offices or when you read the occasional self-help book. I knew I started to want to ask questions that most people weren't. And I wanted to create a space that made you feel like you could just exhale and connect and ground. But if you asked me back then, I didn't have clarity about what my podcast was really about. Because for me, it was just a place for me to start stretching and using my own voice. Because I wanted to get into the habit of speaking, of sharing truth, of sharing vulnerably. And it's been a journey because there are still lessons that I've been learning as I go along. So I think if you would have asked me though, there were pieces. I wanted to use my voice. I wanted to teach women about mindset, healing, leadership, business, entrepreneurship, relationships, your growth journey, spirituality. But those were very broad topics. They weren't the heart of what I was bringing. And I think the big reason for that was I hadn't yet found my own center, my own becoming, my own identity. But you see, somewhere along the way, this podcast stopped being just a thing that I produced and showed up for. And it started to become something that actually built me along the way. Because every conversation, every guest I reached out to, and I just want to take a moment here because I have gotten some incredible yeses solely because I asked, because I was bold enough to try. And for me, it reminds me of how I returned to the boldness I once had that I was afraid of, that I was dimming, much like the women I'm talking to right now. And then when we think about it, it was every solo episode. What would I say? What was I going to teach on? How was I going to share my heart that week? And yet, every question I asked had a funny way of having to ask me something first. Because I would find that I would have these conversations, and the through line would be while I was interviewing for others, for service, for impact, there would be subtle messages that would come through for me, for where I was in my journey, for what I needed to know in that moment. And I think in that aspect, you cannot question that there is something greater than us that is leading the way all the time. And it's funny because before I could ask someone else about courage or nervous system regulation, life would have this way of throwing this navigation of navigating through uncertainty, navigating through real life, through loss. And could I still be the version of myself who showed up even when she was grieving, even when she was a little broken, even when she was uncertain? And I had to learn how to regulate in real time for the impact. And so before I could really speak on some of the topics I speak about, I had to own it. I had to embody it. I had to really grow through the transformation in my own life. And it was because life was asking me to trust in my own becoming. And, you know, there's this funny thing that I think back about, and it was I just wanted to keep up. And if you notice, there was a giant consistency difference from when I first started this last year to now. Because last year, you didn't really know what you were going to get with the podcast. Was this week a solo and a guest? Was it a solo? Was it just a guest? You didn't know because I hadn't yet found the stream. and I hadn't found the direction and the clarity yet. And I learned that in real time while building it. And so it wasn't just about growing a podcast or trying to improve who I am as a coach, as a leader, as a podcast host. It made me realize it wasn't about any other growth outside of my own. Could I show up for myself? And it's funny because when you talk to people and they hear you have a podcast, there's this misconception that happens where people will ask, it must be so easy for you. Or how did you find your voice? And the funny thing is, because I got asked this week, I had to really stop and think about it, because the choice to start the podcast was actually me choosing to stop abandoning my voice, to stop silencing myself, to start trusting in my message. And I think while there has been times where my accent would come out, fun fact most of you don't realize, a little bit of an Armenian accent comes out from time to time. Sometimes I wasn't always polished. Sometimes I had to learn to be more honest, more vulnerable, to lean in, to not be afraid of what would people say if they hear this episode. And you see, at one point, I stopped trying to sound like the podcast host. And instead, I found my own voice. I started to sound like the real Anita. And that might have been one of the greatest gifts I've actually received in running this podcast as long as I have. Because it wasn't about just the platform or the opportunities or the incredible guests, which I'm incredibly grateful for. It was about finding my own voice and finding myself again. So I'm going to touch on this, and I'll probably do a little bit of more in depth in another episode. But when people hear 100 episodes, the part that they don't hear about is everything that happens in between. And it's funny because the podcast has really been a space where I was able to build as I was building my business. So it's watched me transform into identity of fully owning entrepreneurship, fully owning my voice, my worthiness, my abilities, my boldness. But at certain points, it also has seen days where I have questioned myself. I have had doubt. I've had to build from scratch and learn how to figure out tech and uploading and everything in between. I've had to take this action to be bold enough to reach out to some of the people that I've had on the podcast and then have them say yes. And a few no's, but that's a part of life. I've had the opportunity to start keynote speaking, which is something that if you would have told a younger version of myself, I would have never thought that I would have been someone on a stage speaking. Are you kidding me? Instead of singing a song and hiding away and pretending that no one's looking at me? Wow. And now we're a keynote speaker. It's watched me learn how to continue to hold space for women in a deeper way, hold space for myself in a much deeper way. And it's watched me and been an anchor for me as I've lost one of the most important relationships in my life. So it's watched me lose my grandpa and learn how to honor him. It's watched me own up to the boundaries I needed to once set and the conversations that I needed to own. From a place of knowing what I deserve. This has been a space where I've gotten to come as I've been learning to understand life a little differently, as I've been introduced to Kabbalah and other spiritual lessons. It's watched me learn to lean into faith. And I have to be honest, life didn't just pause because I wanted to build this. It happened alongside of it. I learned how to keep showing up through the aspects of life that were some of the most difficult, whether that was setting boundaries that I really didn't want to set, being more vulnerable, allowing people in, losing others. And somehow it's been making the podcast and how I show up a bit more honest. So I really want to acknowledge at a certain point, somewhere along this last year, last 7 months, something finally clicked. I think I gained clarity. It wasn't about trying to teach women how to be someone else. I was trying to help you remember who you already are. Because when I look at everything I speak about, the identity work, nervous system, voice, healing, relationships, money, they all still come and point back to come home to yourself. Remember who you were before you had to become someone else. And that's the core heart of the podcast. And honestly, I think I needed that reminder just as much as anyone else has. Because I used to have moments where I was still operating from a mask. And one of the big things I've learned is consistency. Consistency matters. But you see, I think a lot of times I used to think being consistent meant perfect. I would only show up if the episode was just right, or the editing sounded right, or the lesson was actually valuable. And I'll be honest, there has been episodes where I've pressed publish, but I've thought back and gone, that wasn't my best work. It wasn't my full intent of what I would like for you guys to see. But I've made a commitment to showing up, to being here for you guys, to having a message be shared as long as you need it. And I began to trust myself a little more as I did it, one episode at a time. And you see, that's what consistency really builds. Self-trust. So if you've listened to this since episode 1, thank you. If you've listened to just this episode, thank you. If you've listened to random episodes along the journey, thank you. Thank you for giving me permission to grow in public, for helping me find my voice. You've heard episodes as I was still finding my footing. You've heard me start to refine my message. And now you've watched the show become what it is today. And maybe without even realizing it, we've slowly grown together. So as I was preparing for this episode, I kept asking myself, what do I really want people to leave with? And honestly, I just want to leave you with a single question. Who have you became because you just kept showing up for yourself? Not because everything's gone according to plan or because everything happened in your own timeline, but because you chose not to abandon yourself, not to abandon your mission, not to abandon your heart or your soul. Because when I think about what this 100th episode is really about, it's about creating the person. Because when I think back to the one who hit record on episode 1, I don't really think she'd recognize me either. Not because life looks dramatically different, though there are points, but because I am different. I've learned to lean into my softness, to my groundedness. I'm less interested in proving who I am and more interested in just being unapologetically me and telling the truth. And so, with that, I'm more present because I'm not really considering what it looks like to be impressive. I finally understand something that I don't think I could have understood 100 episodes ago. Because, like I said earlier, the goal isn't to become someone new. It's to remember who I was before the survival, before self-doubt crept in, before I was playing small. So whether you're celebrating your own milestone while you're listening to this, or you're just in a season where no one feels like the effort is being shown, keep showing up. Because every time you do, you're becoming more of the person that your future self will one day thank you for. So, thank you all for sticking with me this long, for every download, every person who's messaged me, who's told me not to give up, for every conversation, every review, and every recommendation to a friend, every moment you've chosen to spend your precious time with me. I'll never take it for granted. So, until our next conversation, I'll see you in the next one.